The tractor was in her soybean field when the water went down. It had come with the flood, the June 2008 event that put 8 feet of water through the Vermilion River bottomland and deposited, among other things, a Massey Ferguson 5460 from her neighbor's operation into the northeast corner of Patricia Kern's 40-acre property outside Eugene, Indiana. The machine had been stored in a low shed near the river. The shed had not survived the flood. The tractor had floated or been pushed or been carried. Nobody was certain of the mechanics. Approximately 400 yards, and come to rest in Patricia's beans with its cab pointed toward the county road and its engine compartment full of river silt. The neighbor's name was Gary Hollis. He farmed 320 acres to Patricia's north and had sustained significant losses in the flood. The shed, the tractor, a grain auger, and roughly 14,000 bushels of corn he had been storing in a low bin that had not been designed for submersion. Gary was 56 years old and insured, and the insurance was going to cover most of the losses, but the coverage on the 5460 was actual cash value, which the adjuster placed at $11,400. The machine was 8 years old, with 6,200 hours on it. $11,400 was what the depreciation schedule said it was worth. What it would cost to restore it from its current condition was more than that. Gary told Patricia this when he came to look at the machine 2 weeks after the flood, standing in her bean field with his boots in the silt that had dried to a pale gray crust over everything the water had touched. He said, "Insurance isn't going to cover a restoration at this point. Machine's not worth what it would take to fix it." Patricia said, "What are you going to do with it?" Gary said, "Scrapper, probably, unless you want it." Patricia looked at the machine. It was 44 years old and had been farming since she was in her 20s and had grown up on her own family's ground 30 miles north before moving to Vermilion County with her husband in 1989 and taking over the 40 acres when he passed in 2004. She ran a small operation, soybeans and a market garden, and maintained her own equipment with the focused practicality of a woman who had been doing her own maintenance since 2004 because the alternative was paying someone else to do it, and the budget did not support that alternative. She said, "I'll take it." Gary said, "It's in rough shape. Flood damage, silt and everything. Electrical's probably gone." Patricia said, "I know what flood damage looks like." Gary said, "I'll sign the title over. It's yours if you want it." Patricia said she wanted it. Gary signed the title over on a Thursday afternoon in July of 2008. Patricia had the machine pulled to her equipment shed with a tractor and a chain and began, on the following Saturday morning, to assess what the flood had left her. Patricia Kern was 47 years old in 2008. She had been doing her own equipment maintenance for 4 years, since the spring after her husband David had died, and she had learned it the way she had learned everything practical in her adult life, by reading the manual, doing the work, making mistakes, and doing it again with the knowledge the mistakes produced. She had not grown up mechanically. Her father had been a veterinarian in Fountain County, and her mother had taught elementary school, and neither of them had prepared her for the specific education of maintaining aging agricultural equipment on a budget that did not permit mistakes. What they had prepared her for was the discipline of learning, the patience to read something carefully, and the honesty to acknowledge when she didn't understand it, and the persistence to find the answer before proceeding. She had applied that discipline to equipment maintenance beginning in the spring of 2005, when her primary tractor had developed a hydraulic problem that the dealer quoted at $1,800 to diagnose and repair. $1,800 was not money Patricia had available without consequence. She had bought the service manual instead, read the relevant sections, determined that the problem was a failed O-ring in the hydraulic pump, ordered the O-ring for $4.30, and replaced it herself on a Sunday afternoon. When the hydraulic system worked correctly the following Monday morning, she understood something about herself that she had not previously verified. She could do this. She had been doing it ever since. By 2008, she had rebuilt a transmission, replaced an injection pump, rewired a cab electrical system, and fabricated a loader bracket from steel she had cut and welded herself after watching 3 tutorial videos and practicing on scrap metal for 2 weekends. The fabrication was not pretty. It worked correctly and it held, and that was the standard she applied. The Massey Ferguson 5460 in her shed presented a different scale of challenge. Flood damage is not a single problem. It is a collection of problems. Silt in the engine, silt in the transmission, silt in the hydraulic system, water in the electrical connections, corrosion beginning wherever water had penetrated and been replaced by air. The problems were not individually impossible. They were collectively significant. Patricia made her list on the first Saturday. The list had 14 items. She worked through them in the order that the machine's systems dictated. Fuel system first, because nothing else mattered if the engine wouldn't run. She flushed the fuel tanks, replaced the fuel filters, cleaned the injectors, and attempted a start. The engine turned but did not fire. She moved to the injection pump, which she had rebuilt once before on a different machine. She rebuilt it again, using a kit she ordered from a supplier in Indianapolis. The engine fired on the following Saturday. It ran rough. She expected that. She let it run for 20 minutes and listened to what the roughness was telling her. 2 things. The turbocharger was damaged, a bearing noise, subtle but present, and one cylinder was not contributing fully to the power output, which suggested a compression problem on that cylinder. She added both to the list. The turbocharger she replaced with a rebuilt unit sourced from a supplier in Terre Haute for $480. The compression problem resolved itself after 3 heat cycles as the engine expanded and seated components that the silt intrusion had displaced. She had not expected that resolution and noted it in her repair log as compression issue, resolved without intervention after heat cycling, mechanism unclear, note for future reference. The note for future reference was characteristic. Patricia kept a repair log for every machine she worked on, recording not just what she had done, but what she had observed and what she had concluded and what she remained uncertain about. The log had been a practice she started in 2005 and had maintained since. By 2008, it was 4 notebooks, organized by machine and date, representing 3 years of accumulated mechanical knowledge that she had built from nothing. The 5460 got its own notebook. By November of 2008, 5 months after Gary Hollis had signed the title over in Patricia's soybean field, the Massey Ferguson 5460 was running. Not perfectly. There were systems she had addressed provisionally and intended to revisit, and the cab electrical was functional but not entirely clean. But running. It ran correctly enough to work, which was the standard that mattered. She used it through the fall on her own ground and found it adequate for what her 40 acres required. The engine produced power without hesitation. The hydraulics functioned correctly. The transmission shifted through all ranges without grinding. Whatever the flood had done to the machine, Patricia's 5 months of work had addressed enough of it that the machine was operational. In December, her neighbor to the south, a farmer named Walt Prescott, who farmed 200 acres and ran an aging Massey Ferguson 390 as his primary tractor, asked Patricia if she had heard about the 5460 she'd taken from Gary Hollis. Patricia said she had it in her shed. Walt said, "I heard you fixed it up." Patricia said, "It's running, yes." Walt said, "I've got a problem with my 390, hydraulic pump. The dealer wants $1,200 for the repair. I can't get them out here before February, and I need the tractor for feeding livestock through the winter." Patricia said, "What's wrong with the pump specifically?" Walt described the symptoms. Patricia said it sounded like the pump seal, possibly the gear set if the seal had been leaking long enough to run the pump low. She said she'd look at it if he brought it over. Walt brought it over on a Saturday. Patricia spent 2 hours diagnosing and determined the problem was the rear seal, the simpler of the 2 possibilities, with no damage to the gear set. She had the seal in her parts stock, left over from a previous repair. She replaced it on Sunday. Walt's tractor was running correctly on Monday. Walt asked what he owed her. Patricia said $40 for the seal. Walt said, "What about the labor?" Patricia said, "An hour and a half." Walt said, "What do you charge?" Patricia thought about it for a moment. She had not charged labor before. She said, $40 an hour. Walt said, "That's less than the dealer." Patricia said, "I'm not the dealer." Walt paid $80 and drove home. He told 3 farmers at the elevator the following week. All 3 of them called Patricia before January. The pattern that established itself in the winter of 2008 and 2009 followed the logic that all such patterns follow. A neighbor needed something, the something was available, the transaction was fair, and the neighbor told other neighbors. By the spring of 2009, Patricia had done repair work for 7 farms in Vermilion County. By the fall, 11. By the spring of 2010, 17. She was working evenings and weekends and had begun turning work away. Not because she lacked the skill, but because she lacked the hours. And the hours she had were needed for her own 40 acres during planting and harvest. She thought about this problem the way she thought about mechanical problems, by identifying what the constraint was and determining whether it could be addressed without compromising what was working. The constraint was time. The solution was help. The complication was that help cost money, and the repair business was not yet generating enough to cover the cost of help at rates that competent mechanics commanded. She solved it in a way that the situation suggested. In the spring of 2010, she hired a recent high school graduate named Tyler Marsh, who had grown up on a farm in Fountain County and had been working at a grain elevator since graduation because nothing else immediately available. Tyler had no formal mechanical training. He had grown up maintaining equipment with his father and had the practical knowledge that farm upbringings produce in people who pay attention. Patricia paid him $12 an hour and spent the first 3 months teaching him the standard she applied to repair work. The standard was simple. Understand the problem before addressing it. Address it correctly the first time. Document what you found and what you did. Tyler absorbed it with the specific receptiveness of someone who has been doing things intuitively and is now being given language for the intuition. By the fall of 2010, he was handling routine repairs without supervision and bringing Patricia the complex ones for consultation before proceeding. She hired a second mechanic in 2012, a third in 2014. The repair business crossed $100,000 in annual revenue in 2011. Patricia noted it in her farm journal with the same plainness she applied to yield records and maintenance logs. A fact, recorded because facts should be recorded. By 2015, the shed that Gary Hollis's tractor had floated into was no longer adequate. Patricia built an addition, 30 feet of concrete block, 2 additional bays, wiring for a second welding station, $38,000 paid from operating revenue without financing. What she had built in 7 years was not what she had planned to build in 2008. She had planned to strip a flooded tractor for usable parts. Instead, she had a repair business with 3 mechanics, a client base across 4 counties, and a shed that had been expanded once and would need expanding again before long. The business had not been designed. It had been built from what the situation required, one decision at a time, each decision made with the same standards she applied to everything. Understand the problem, address it correctly, document what you found. The Massey Ferguson 5460 was still in her operation. She had addressed the provisional repairs in 2010 and 2013, and by 2015 the machine was as sound as any flood-damaged tractor rebuilt from silt could be. It had crossed 9,000 hours. She maintained it by the log, by the schedule, by the standard that the first repair had established and every subsequent repair had maintained. Gary Hollis came to Patricia's shed in the spring of 2016. He had sold his operation in 2013. The combination of the 2012 drought and his own decision to retire had produced a sale to a younger farmer who was expanding in the county. Gary was 64 years old and had been living in town for 3 years. He came to Patricia's shed because he had been driving past on Route 17 and had seen the addition, the service trucks in the lot, the sign on the building that said Kern Agricultural Services in plain black letters on a white background. He stood in the lot and looked at the sign for a moment. Then he went to the shed door. Patricia was inside with Tyler, going over the diagnosis on a combine that had come in the previous day. Gary said, "I heard you built something here." Patricia said, "I did." Gary looked around the shed. The lifts, the parts shelving, the second welding station, the organized tool storage, the 4 machines in various stages of attention. He said, "Out of the tractor I gave you." Patricia said, "The tractor was the beginning. The rest came after." Gary said, "How much is it doing?" Patricia said, "Enough." Gary said, "I should have known you'd do something with it." Patricia looked at him. Then she said, "You said take it or call the scrapper." "I took it." Gary said, "I know. I'm glad you did." He looked at the 5460, which was parked in the corner of the shed in the space it had occupied since 2008. It was the oldest machine in Patricia's shed and the one with the most complicated history. The silt in the fuel system, the turbocharger bearing, the provisional repairs, the 8 years of service since. Gary looked at it for a long time. He said, "Does it still run?" Patricia said, "Every day I need it to." Gary said, "I put 4,200 hours on it before the flood." "You've put how many since?" Patricia said, "About 5,000. Gary nodded. He said, 9,200 hours total. Patricia said, "Give or take." Gary was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I signed that title over because I figured it was junk. I figured maybe you could get a few parts off it." Patricia said, "It wasn't junk. It needed work." Gary said, "Most things do." He thanked her for her time and drove back to town. Patricia went back to the combine diagnosis. By 2020, Kern Agricultural Services had 6 employees and $340,000 in annual revenue. The business had grown in the way that things grow when they solve a real problem at a fair price, steadily, without advertising, through the specific word of mouth that flows in farming communities when something works correctly and the person doing it can be trusted. Patricia's 6 employees were all people she had trained. Tyler Marsh, the first, was now her shop manager. 12 years in the shop had made him the kind of mechanic that dealers spend years trying to develop and often fail to retain. The kind who can diagnose a problem from a description over the phone with sufficient accuracy that the parts are ordered before the machine arrives. The others had come at different points in the business's growth, each selected for the same quality: farm background, practical knowledge, the willingness to learn the standard and apply it consistently without cutting the corners that are always tempting to cut when the simpler solution is close at hand and the correct solution requires more time. Patricia had turned down 3 offers to buy the business since 2016. The first was from a dealer group that wanted to add an independent service operation to their county presence. The second was from a private equity firm that was assembling agricultural service businesses across the Midwest. The third was from a regional competitor who had identified Patricia's client base as a strategic acquisition. Each offer had been financially significant. Patricia had turned each one down with the same reasoning she applied to any decision. The business was doing what it was supposed to do, which was provide correct repair service to farming operations in her county at a fair price, and selling it to an entity whose interest was financial return rather than correct service would change what it was and what it did. She was not interested in changing what it was what she had built it to be. The 40 acres Patricia had been farming when Gary Hollis signed over the 5460 were still being farmed. She leased half of them to a neighbor and worked the other 20 herself with a smaller equipment set, doing the field work on evenings and weekends with the specific efficiency of someone who has been farming 40 acres alone for 20 years and has the schedule organized around the work without thinking about it. The Massey Ferguson 5460 was still in the shed. Patricia had rebuilt the engine in 2017, not because it had failed, but because the hour count and the compression tests and the oil analysis had told her collectively that the rebuild window was approaching, and that approaching it on her schedule was better than arriving at it under the pressure of a field failure. The rebuild had cost her $3,200 in parts and 2 weeks of her own time. After the rebuild, the engine ran as clean as it had run in 2001, when Gary Hollis had bought it new. In the spring of 2020, Gary Hollis brought his son-in-law's tractor to Kern Agricultural Services for a hydraulic repair. Gary had moved back to Vermilion County the previous fall to a smaller property, doing some hobby farming that the son-in-law helped with when his schedule allowed. The tractor was a different brand, not Massey Ferguson. Patricia's shop worked on all brands. Gary dropped it off on a Monday morning. Patricia was in the shop with Tyler when Gary walked in. She looked at the work order, looked at the tractor, and said they'd have a diagnosis by Wednesday. Gary said, "No rush. I appreciate you taking it." Patricia said, "That's what we do." Gary looked around the shop, 6 bays occupied, 4 mechanics visible, the parts shelving that covered 2 walls, the documentation system on the office computer that Patricia had built from her original paper notebooks. He said, 12 years from that tractor in your soybean field to this." Patricia said, 12 years and a lot of Saturdays. Gary said, "Was it worth it?" Patricia looked at him. Then she said, "Gary, you signed over a flooded tractor because you figured I might get a few parts off it. I got 12 years of work out of it and 6 employees and enough revenue to do it right. Was it worth it? Good, I suppose that answers it. Wednesday on the diagnosis. Tyler will call you." Gary nodded and left. Patricia went back to the combine she had been working on before he arrived. The Massey Ferguson 5460 was in the corner of the shop where it had been since 2008. 9,200 hours on the body, 3,000 on the rebuilt engine. The repair log that Patricia had started when the flood left it in her soybean field was in the filing cabinet in the office. 12 years of entries, the complete history of a machine that had arrived full of river silt and been made to run and had kept running because someone had decided it was worth making run. It was worth it. Patricia had known that in July of 2008 when Gary Hollis stood in her soybean field and said, "Take it or call the scrapper." She had not known it would become $340,000 in annual revenue and 6 employees and a sign on the building in plain black letters on a white background. She had known it was worth making run. The rest had followed from that. It always did. The tractor was at her gate when she came back from the school run. It was a Tuesday morning in September of 1987, and Carol Denton had dropped her 2 sons at Fountain Central Elementary and driven back to her 40-acre property outside Covington, Indiana, to find a Massey Ferguson 2680 sitting at the end of her gravel drive with its front wheels in the ditch and a note tucked under the windshield wiper. The note was from Gary Pruitt, the owner of Pruitt Farm Equipment on Route 136. It said, "Carol, brought this one out. It's yours if you want it. Can't move it on the lot. Engine seized, hydraulics gone. If you don't want it, call the shop and we'll arrange to haul it off." Gary. Carol read the note twice. She was 34 years old. She had been widowed 14 months earlier when her husband Tom had died of a heart attack at 41, leaving her with 2 boys aged 7 and 9, 80 acres of rented farmland that she was trying In the spring of 1988, her neighbor Warren Falk, who farmed 400 acres to her north and had been one of the people who helped Carol through the first months after Tom's death in the practical, present way that farming neighbors help, by showing up with equipment when equipment was needed, asked Carol if she would be willing to service his Massey Ferguson 390 on a regular basis. Not just fix it when it broke, but maintain it. Oil changes, filter replacements, fluid checks, pre-season inspections. Warren said he trusted Carol's hands more than he trusted the dealers, and he was tired of scheduling around the dealer's availability, which was never convenient during planting or harvest. Carol asked what he had in mind. Warren said he would pay her a flat fee for the year, and she could schedule the work at times that suited her farm calendar. He said he would pay whatever she thought was fair. Carol thought about it for a day. Then she wrote a number on a piece of paper and gave it to Warren. $280 per year, covering 2 full services and 1 pre-season inspection. Warren said that was less than the dealer charged for 1 service. Carol said she knew that. Warren said he would pay more if she wanted. Carol said $280 was what the work cost her, with a reasonable return on her time, and that was what she intended to charge. Warren signed. He sent his neighbor Harold to Carol the following week. Harold signed. By the end of 1988, Carol had 6 service agreements. She had not advertised. She had not told anyone she was offering agreements. She had written a number on a piece of paper for a neighbor who asked, and the neighbor had told other neighbors, and the other neighbors had called. This was how word moved in Fountain County, through the specific channels of people who trusted each other's judgment, where a recommendation from Warren Falk was worth more than any advertisement, because Warren Falk was known to be careful about what he recommended. By the end of 1990, Carol had 23 service agreements. By the end of 1993, she had 61. She had hired her first part-time helper in 1992, a retired mechanic named Phil, who had worked at the Massey Ferguson dealer in Attica for 21 years, and who brought to Carol's shed the specific institutional knowledge of a man who had seen the same failure modes on the same models repeated across 2 decades, and knew without looking what was wrong and what the fix required. Phil worked 3 days a week. Carol paid him $40 an hour. The rate was fair, and Phil knew it was fair and did not ask for more, which Carol took as confirmation that the rate was correct. The service agreement model that Carol had built by accident in 1988 turned out to solve a problem that was larger than Warren Falk's scheduling frustration. The problem was this: the farmers in her area who ran Massey Ferguson equipment, and there were many of them because the brand had been well represented in Fountain County since the 1970s, and because the farmers who bought it tended to keep it rather than trade it on the upgrade cycles that newer brands encouraged, were maintaining their machines reactively. They fixed what broke. They serviced what demanded service. They deferred what could be deferred because deferring was cheaper in the short term, and the short term was always the term that the farm budget was most pressured by. Reactive maintenance is more expensive than preventive maintenance across any reasonable planning horizon. Carol knew this from Tom's margin notes, and from Phil's 21 years at the dealer, and from her own 11 years of watching what broke and why. A hydraulic pump that failed because it ran low on fluid for 6 months cost more to repair than the fluid check that would have caught the level dropping. An injection pump that failed because a filter had been run past its service life cost more to replace than the filter that should have been changed 3 months earlier. The math was not complicated. The obstacle was not the math. The obstacle was the structure, finding the time, scheduling the work, paying the bill when it arrived after a month that had already been tight. The service agreement removed the obstacle. Fixed annual fee, budgeted and paid in advance, work done on a schedule. Carol controlled at times that didn't conflict with the critical periods of the farm calendar. The farmer knew the cost before the year started. Carol knew the revenue before the year started. Both parties knew what was expected and when. The uncertainty, the breakdown during planting, The dealer visit that couldn't be scheduled for 2 weeks, the repair bill that arrived in a month when the cash wasn't there, was removed from the equation for the farmers who enrolled. Those farmers' machines lasted longer, their breakdown rates dropped, their unplanned repair costs fell. Carol tracked this because Carol tracked everything, in the same notebooks she had kept since 1988, and by 1995 the data was unambiguous. A farm on a service agreement with her averaged one unplanned repair event per year per machine. A farm not on an agreement averaged 3.4. She did not publish this data. She mentioned it when asked to farmers who were considering an agreement and wanted to understand the value. The farmers who heard it understood it because they understood machinery, and they understood the cost of downtime during planting and the cost of a breakdown during harvest. And they could calculate from their own recent history what 3.4 unplanned repair events per year had cost them compared to what one would have cost. Most of them signed. By 2001, Carol Denton's service agreement base had reached 312 contracts across 7 counties. Her annual revenue was $214,000. She had 3 mechanics on staff: Phil, who was now working 4 days a week, a younger man named Steve, who had come to her shed as a customer in 1997 with a machine she repaired so correctly that he asked if she was hiring, and a woman named Janet, who had grown up on a farm in Warren County and had the mechanical instincts that farm upbringings produce in people who pay close attention to things that break and understand why. None of this had been planned. Carol had not written a business plan in 1987 or 1988 or at any point since. She had fixed a tractor because the tractor could be fixed and she could fix it. She had maintained Warren Falk's machine because Warren had asked and the work was available to her. She had written a number on a piece of paper because the number was what the work cost and a fair return on her time, and charging more than that was not something she was built to do. Everything after that had followed from those 3 decisions, as naturally as water follows a drainage grade. Not because someone designed the path, but because the path was where the conditions pointed. The 2680 that Gary Pruitt had left at her gate in 1987 was still working. It had crossed 17,000 hours in 2000. Carol had rebuilt the engine once, in 1996, when compression testing during a routine inspection showed that the time had come. The rebuild cost her $1,200 in parts and a week of her own labor. After the rebuild, the engine ran as clean as it had in 1988 when she first started it in the February cold. Gary Pruitt retired in 1999 and sold Pruitt Farm Equipment to a younger dealer group that rebranded and expanded and then contracted when the farm economy tightened after 2002, and the customer base that the expansion had assumed did not materialize at the assumed volume. By 2005, the successor dealership had closed its Covington location. The nearest Massey Ferguson dealer was now 41 miles away. Carol noticed this development the way she noticed everything, with attention, without comment, and with an understanding of what it meant for her business. The farms in her area that had been sending warranty work and scheduled maintenance to the dealer would now either drive 41 miles or find another option. Carol was the other option. She added 16 new service agreements in the 6 months following the Covington dealership closure. By the end of 2006, her agreement base was 593 contracts. She thought about Gary Pruitt sometimes when she was driving between farms on her service route, the truck stocked with filters and fluids and the tools for whatever the day's schedule required. She thought about the note under the windshield wiper and the question it had contained. If you don't want it, call the shop and we'll arrange to haul it off. She had not called the shop. She had kept the machine and fixed it and built something around what fixing it had taught her about what the farms in her area needed and didn't have. Gary had left the 2680 because he couldn't move it. Carol had kept it because she could see what it was worth before it was worth anything. That difference between seeing the value and not seeing it was not a difference in intelligence or information. Gary had been in the farm equipment business for 30 years. He knew Massey Ferguson machines. He had looked at the 2680 and seen an $800 loss. Carol had looked at it and seen a path. The path had taken 22 years to walk to its current point. Carol was 56 years old. She had walked it one service agreement at a time. In September of 2009, Carol Denton's service agreement base reached 847 contracts. The number arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week the 2680 had been left at her gate 22 years earlier. Carol noticed this when she updated her contract log at the end of the day. She sat with it for a moment. Then she wrote the number in the log, 847, the way she wrote every number in every log, accurately, completely, without inflation or diminishment. Her annual revenue that year was $498,000. By the time the year's final contracts were settled, it crossed $500,000. Carol noted that number too and closed the log and went to check on the 2680, which was in the shed because she had pulled it in for an oil change that afternoon. The engine ran at idle with the same even note it had been running since the February morning in 1988 when she first heard it, 22 years of correct maintenance having produced in the machine the specific mechanical character of something that has been treated well across a long time. She checked the oil, clean, at level. She checked the hydraulic fluid, full, clear. She greased the fittings. She noted the hour meter, 19,412. She shut it down. She put her tools away. She turned off the shed lights. Outside, the September fields were done for another season. The 847 farms whose machines she maintained were already thinking about fall tillage and winter preparation and what the following spring would require. Their machines were ready for whatever they decided because their machines had been maintained through the year, the way machines need to be maintained. Preventively, consistently, by someone who knew what she was doing and charged what the work was worth. Gary Pruitt had left a machine at her gate because he couldn't find a use for it. Carol Denton had found 847 uses for what fixing it had taught her. The machine was still in the shed. The number was in the log. And in the morning, there would be more work. There was always more work. That had never changed.